We are, this semester we will be studying the books of Ruth and Esther. And just to start with a recap last week, especially since some of y'all were not here, we looked at the entire first chapter of Ruth. And when we were looking at it, we saw right at the beginning, it talks about how this story takes place in the time of Judges. And when we see that in this passage, like, it's not just trying to give us a general time frame or anything. The time of Judges was not a great time to be in Israel. They were kind of just in this vicious cycle of sinning against God, bad things happen, they say sorry, then they start doing bad, stupid stuff again, and it's just this vicious circle of things going wrong. And so at this time, the people of Israel were not very moral. It was very much an anything goes. And so when we see in the time of the Judges, we know that this is not the right time to be there. Almost like when Katniss enters the arena in Hunger Games. Like, you just know it's not probably going to end well. But we see in the story of Ruth, that we see this understanding of God's covenant, or the promise he makes with his people. All the way back in Genesis 12, we see God make this promise that he will bless Abraham, and that through Abraham, he will bless the nations. And that there's this top line and this bottom line of the covenant. We are told that Abraham would receive land, family, and that the entire world would be blessed through this blessing. So the top line is that God will bless his people. The bottom line is that his people are to bless the nations. And this is important because Ruth is a foreigner. And not only is she a foreigner, she is from the land of Moab. And they are the absolute enemy of Israel, of God's people. And so, yet we see God's promise to Ruth. And so I'm actually going to play the video from last week, just as a recap, and then we'll pick back up.
If we looked at a timeline of the Old Testament, we would find the book of Ruth happening during the time of Judges, before 1 Samuel, but after Joshua. In Judah, there's a town named Bethlehem, and in that town, there's a man named Elimelech who is married to a woman named Naomi. They have two sons named Mahlon and Chilion. In those days, there's a famine in Bethlehem, and they decide to travel to the country of Moab to sojourn there, which means they didn't intend to stay permanently. While in Moab, Elimelech dies, leaving Naomi with the two sons. These two sons married women from Moab. Chilion married a woman named Orpah, and Mahlon married a woman named Ruth. After 10 years of living in Moab, Mahlon and Chilion die, thus leaving Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth widowed. Naomi is now in a foreign land, without her husband, and without her sons. Naomi hears that the famine in Bethlehem is over, and desires to return home. She turns to her two daughters-in-law and tells them to return to their families. But Ruth and Orpah refuse, saying they will go with Naomi. This is how Naomi responds. Why would you? I don't have any sons to give you for husbands, and I'm too old to get a husband to have more sons for you. But even if I did, would you wait for them, refrain from marriage until they were old enough? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Together they wept. Orpah kissed Naomi goodbye and went home, but Ruth stayed. Naomi argues, but Ruth says, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you, for where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." They then traveled to Bethlehem together. When they had returned, the town was stirred up because of them, asking if this was really Naomi. Her response is, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi, when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So they returned to Bethlehem, Ruth with her mother-in-law, Naomi.
Awesome. And so that's just a recap. That's what happens in this story so far. And we see that Ruth basically makes this awesome covenant declaration that your people will be my people and your God my God. I'm not going to leave you. And this covenant promise, this covenant faithfulness is just such a beautiful act. But we also saw that she gave up a ton because Naomi had nothing to give her. There was no husband, no sons for protection. And again, in Israel, things aren't great. Morality is pretty low. And so there's no sense of protection. There's no sense of income. It was a life of poverty and struggle. Yet Naomi ends up having her daughter-in-law return home with her, this foreigner, and she takes on her people and she puts her faith in Naomi's God. And so Ruth shows incredible faith in the God of Israel, the God that each and every one of us worships. And so our story picks up in chapter 2, and we're going to listen to the video and then go through verse by verse.
In chapter 1, we learn about where Ruth came from. A man named Elimelech marries a woman named Naomi in the town of Bethlehem. They have 2 sons, and they all travel to Moab during a famine. Elimelech dies, and the 2 sons marry women from Moab. One marries Orpah, the other marries Ruth. Those 2 men die in Moab, and Naomi decides to return to Bethlehem. Orpah returns to her family, but Ruth travels with Naomi back to Bethlehem. Chapter 2 begins with Ruth asking Naomi if she could go and glean from the fields. To glean means to go into other people's fields and gather the grain that was accidentally left behind by the harvest workers. This was generally done by the poor, the foreigner, and the widow. As Ruth is gleaning, she comes across a field belonging to a man named Boaz. He was a righteous man from the same clan as Ruth's father-in-law, Elimelech, who had died. As Boaz is going through his fields, he notices Ruth and asks one of his workers about her. The man responds, "She's the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi. She asked if she could glean here and has been working since early morning, except for a short rest." Boaz then says to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter. Stay and glean with the women here on these fields. Don't go to anyone else's. These men won't harm you, and when you are thirsty, you may drink the water that my workers have." Ruth falls to her face, bowing to him, and saying, "Why have I found favor in your eyes? I'm a foreigner." Boaz responds, "I've heard about your situation. I've heard that your husband has died, but that you chose to leave your family, friends, and country to stay with your mother-in-law in a foreign land. May the Lord bless you for this." Ruth is very thankful and goes back to gleaning. At mealtime, Boaz calls to her and brings her to the table of the workers to eat and drink with them. She ate until she was full and even had leftovers, which she saved. When she goes back to work, Boaz tells his workers to let her glean even in places that they haven't harvested, and don't rebuke her for it. He even tells them to leave some extra grains of wheat for her. At the end of the day, Ruth goes home with about an ephah of barley, which is about 5.5 gallons, enough to feed 2 women for at least 2 weeks, and she tells Naomi about Boaz, the man who owns the field. Naomi informs her that Boaz is a close relative of theirs and tells Ruth to stay with Boaz and work only in that field. So Ruth gleaned in the field belonging to Boaz until the end of the harvest and continued living with her mother-in-law, Naomi.
Awesome. So, one second. Awesome. There we go. So yeah, right after they get back to Bethlehem, it picks up with chapter 2, verse 1. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. Again, remember, having a husband or having a male relative in ancient Israel society was incredibly important because the land and the finances and everything passed through the male line, and the men had an obligation that if their brother or relative's wife lived longer than the husband, that somebody would marry and continue to provide the protection and security. And so the fact that Boaz is from the line of Elimelech is important for us to know, but at the same time, this is the narrator telling us this, so Ruth has no idea. But Boaz probably ends up being a distant relative of Ruth or of Naomi, because a clan was bigger than like an extended family, but still not a whole tribe. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whom I shall find favor." And he said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she set out and went and gleaned the field after the reapers, and happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem. And he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his young man, who was in charge of the reapers, "Who is this young woman?" And the servant who was in charge answered, "She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers." So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. So we see, like I said, we knew that Naomi and Ruth were probably going to have a tough time once they got back to the promised land, that things were just not looking good. And what Naomi's having to do is basically go behind the farmers and pick up the scraps that they don't get, that they don't see hit the ground or fall out of their baskets or whatever. And this was typical Jewish law at the time to do this. This was a way of God providing for the poor, the sojourner, and the widow. It was an act of grace that God wrote into his law for Israel. Yet we see that it's still far from ideal, that she's spending all day just picking up the scraps. Like, the best thing to like a modern day like reference I could come up with is like, imagine if restaurants in town, whatever food they didn't sell at the end of the night, had to put it on around their building, and the needy and poor could come and pick it up. But they can only pick up what wasn't wanted by the restaurant or by the customers. So the absolute scraps, not quite dumpster diving, but getting there. And yet Ruth is working hard. She's going from sun up until lunchtime. And Ruth is not just looking for food, but she's looking for favor. The word that you will hear us use, and the same word that this translates to, is grace. Ruth was looking for grace, knowing she didn't necessarily deserve anything. She knew she had a right under Jewish law to go walk around the fields, but she didn't have any claim to anything else. And as a Moabite woman, she certainly did not have a claim in Israel to anything else. Like, just imagine being in that spot where you're in a land you don't know, where all the people hate you, and you have to literally work sun up to sundown to hopefully get enough food that you can eat that at the end of the night. And yet, we also start to see just who Boaz is, because he uses covenant language. And at this time, that is a sign that Boaz is of high character, that he's a good guy. But Boaz using this covenant name shows us this high character, and this ends up being a big theme that we see over and over again throughout this story. So we have Ruth, lonely, poor, completely out of her comfort zone. Then we have Boaz, the owner of this field, and we know that he comes from the clan of Elimelech, and that he's a man of high character, but we don't know much else. But then the story continues, looking at verses 8 through 13. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter, do not go and glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young woman. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged the young man not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "What have I done why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" But Boaz answered, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Then she said, "I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servants, though I am not as if I was one of your servants, though I am not one of your servants." And so, right here we get a good picture of that top line, bottom line. Ruth, the foreigner, the outcast, the one that doesn't belong, the one that is completely down on her luck, ends up receiving so much more from Boaz than she ever was required to get. The Jewish law simply just said that they had to provide, they couldn't go back around the second time and pick up what they missed the first time, that they had to leave that for the poor. So what Naomi was doing was all that the law required her to be able to do. Yet, Boaz goes above and beyond. He says, "Stick close to the woman, to my woman, to the woman of the servants, to the women that are on this property, and glean with them. Don't be with the poor people. Don't be with the outcasts. You can be a part of my group. Go with them. When you're thirsty, you have any right to the water that my men have drawn." Just over and over again, Boaz just pours out this grace, this very physical blessing for Ruth. And we see Ruth is overwhelmed by this grace. She literally falls to the floor in awe that she's being treated this way. And this is, like, it might seem a little over the top for us, but again, just imagine being in her shoes. Imagine being in a place you don't know with people who don't really like you, and you're afraid for your life, and the next thing you know is this man comes up to you and just goes above and beyond to make sure that you are okay. As a Moabite, she would have been seen as an enemy to God, yet it's her faith that makes her a part of God's people. And we see that she has been taken in through the language used. Boaz praying that the Lord would give her refuge, that he would take her in, that she would receive the promises of the covenant. We see the enemy become a friend of God, and more than that, become part of the family of God because of her faith. And yet this grace continues, so already Ruth is blown away and it only gets better. And at mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine." So she sat beside the reapers as he passed to her roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied, and yet had some left over. When she rose to glean, he instructed his young man, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her, and pull out some from the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean." This is just, again, completely above and beyond what could possibly expected. So Boaz, who has already gone beyond the bare minimum, now is saying, literally just let her go to the stuff that hasn't even been picked. She can pick from it. And then on top of that, pull some for her to take. He's just above and beyond showing her grace. And yet, this reminds me of a different point in Scripture. When Jesus fed the 5,000 with a couple of loaves of bread and some fish, and these people who had not ate until they were completely satisfied. Because when we come back to God, when we become part of the covenant, we receive life abundantly. We eat until we are full. We are completely satisfied. But yet, the story doesn't end there. We see Ruth head home with an abundance, taking the leftovers from the meal and the 5 gallons worth of barley. After one day, she has enough to eat for 2 weeks. When she went to the field, she wasn't sure she would have enough to eat that night. And we see Ruth repeat the day's events to her mother-in-law. So she gleaned until the evening, and then she beat out what she had gleaned, and she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned, and also what food she brought left over after being satisfied. And her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Bless the man who took notice of you." Like, they were so afraid that she wouldn't even find a place that would let her pick up the scraps. So imagine sitting there all day wondering if you were going to get a meal, and then Ruth shows up with just food on top of food. Like, this would be like in that picture of going to a restaurant, hoping that there's a couple of breadsticks left out at the end of the night at Olive Garden, and coming back with an entire 10-course feast. Like, it's just above and beyond what we could possibly imagine. And then we see Naomi, who literally in the last chapter said, "Call me Mara, for the Lord has dealt bitterly with me," respond with, "Blessed be the man who did this. Let the Lord bless him." So Ruth told her mother-in-law who she had worked with, and the man's name was Boaz. Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May be blessed with the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "This man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." And Ruth the Moabite said, "Besides, he said to me, 'You shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest.'" And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young woman, lest in another field you will be assaulted." So she kept close to the young woman of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests, and she lived with her mother-in-law. And so that's where our story ends today, but we see just, when we see the reaction in verse 18, we see just the abundance of grace that was poured out on the outsider, Ruth. But verse 19 also shows us the beauty of grace, because Naomi, like I said, was literally saying the Lord had dealt poorly with her last chapter, is now calling out his name and proclaiming and praying for blessing for the man that showed Ruth so much grace. For us who are in Christ, when we are in the covenant with God, when we extend grace and when we receive grace, the world takes notice. Just like Naomi took notice, I know in my own personal story, it was just the unconditional love and grace that my friends who were Christians showed me. And trust me, I was the outsider. When I told one of my teachers that I was a youth director in Williamsburg, Virginia, she literally told me to shut up and stop lying to her. That was what I was in high school, and yet my friends kept pointing me to the cross, showing me grace. And one day I finally just started saying, I want what they got. I don't know what it is, but there's something special. And as my buddy Cal discipled me, I realized it was Jesus that made them special. And we see the top line and bottom line of the covenant here again. Like Boaz, who's been blessed, like he has this huge field, all these servants, all this staff. He is incredibly blessed, and he ends up blessing Ruth in abundance. And in turn, Ruth this outsider, ends up blessing her mother-in-law. And Naomi starts to come back to God because of this top line, bottom line being lived out. Like this shows us when we come back to God, we find a Redeemer that showers us with grace. Verses 20 through 23, when they left, they were married, and yet when they came back, they had nothing. And Naomi says it herself, "Blessed be God for not forgetting the living or the dead." They didn't deserve anything. They left God. But yet when they came back, they received grace on top of grace. They receive a Redeemer. And yet we still see that not to go to other fields. When we leave the presence of God, it's not safe. When we leave our relationship with God, the grace turns back to emptiness. That true redemption, that true life to the full, true satisfaction only comes with Him. Please join me in prayer. Dear God, thank you for this night. Thank you for these students. Thank you for the book of Ruth, for your promise of a Redeemer. Not just a Redeemer in the here and now, but a Redeemer for all of eternity. Lord, let us be like Ruth and Naomi. Lead us back to you and shower us with grace and life abundantly, life to the full. And we lift this up in your name. Amen. All right, so we'll have time to hang out, play some of our games, all that good stuff. But we do have some announcements to make, and we had been saying that there was some pretty big news. Let me stop.